Thank you very much, Shumon, for being with us in Unprepared workshop. It's an extreme honor. I'm really very happy and very much looking forward to to conversing with you today and to hear the things that you're gonna tell us. Shumon Basar is a writer, curator, and cultural critic. He's a commissioner of Global Art Forum in Dubai, or in Art Dubai. He's an editor-at-large at Tant magazine, contributing editor at Bidun, adjunct curator for Art Jamil, and a member of the Fondazione Prada Thought Council. Together with Douglas Copeland and Hans-Ulrich Obrist, he is co-author of The Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present, as well as and also co-authored with the same group, The Extreme Self, a book that came out in 2021, a kind of graphic novel that shows how people have been morphing into something else. And this publication is basically also accompanied or kind of also respond or correspond with an exhibition, the exhibition Age of You, which was shown at MoCA in Toronto and at the Jamil Arts Center in Dubai. Hello, Shumon, welcome again. We have this in Unprepared is a workshop that focuses on, that works with young practitioners on thinking about, what we do, why we do it, for whom we do it, and for how many, not necessarily only like in terms of numbers, but also for how many, in many sorts of ways. And I think it's very interesting as I go through your book, The Extreme Self, as one understands how many versions of oneself could exist through all these navigations of cultural, offerings or image offerings, and that kind of affect us and perhaps affect the way we also produce an image of ourselves or lives of ourselves on and off screen. So I'll pass the microphone or the space for you to present what you've prepared for us, and
sure.
We will happily take questions from the participants or from the guests in this talk. So please, for whoever has questions, please raise your hand or drop it in the chat box. Normally we have a simultaneous translation into Arabic, but unfortunately this week our colleague, who's also a member of the group, is not with us, so there will be no translation, but I'm happy to help with whoever needs help with this with translation as needed. Of course. So welcome.
Yeah. No, and if anything is unclear, please do feel free to interrupt and ask, and I'm sure between myself and Ala we'll be able to figure it out. Thank you for the invitation, Ala. It's a pleasure to join you all this evening. So yeah, I've sort of prepared a presentation, you could say, and but it's really to, I guess, introduce a number of concepts and themes, and then hopefully we can talk about it afterwards. So I'm just going to do the proverbial screen share. Ala, can you see that?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, I want to start here with this quote, which I like very much, from the writer J.G. Ballard, who some of you may have heard of. The author of different novels like Crash and the Atrocity Exhibition. But he once said that all obsessions are extreme metaphors waiting to be born. All obsessions are extreme metaphors waiting to be born. And he famously pursued his his obsessions, many of which were formed, you could say, unconsciously in his childhood when he was actually a prisoner of war in a camp in Shanghai, and which later on became a notable film that some of you may have heard of, called Empire of the Sun, directed by Steven Spielberg. But this notion of listening to your obsessions, I think, is something I think is very interesting, and I've been guided by over the years. So what I want to offer up are a number of observations from recent work, and even more recent, what I call pattern recognition, cultural pattern recognition. And almost all of these have somehow taken shape and concretized over the last 20 months, of course, as time has become untimed and our news feeds read more dystopianly than most science fiction now does. So you see, my main obsession over the last decade has been around how change is changing and how change keeps changing. So change, we talk about change, of course, this changes, that changes, but the notion of change itself is always changing as well. It's a kind of, it's reflexive. It's something that, it's like a Chris Nolan movie. It's like Inception as well. So firstly, I want to go back to 1967. This gentleman on the left is Marshall McLuhan. He was a Canadian professor of literature and media studies, and he became very famous because of this book in the middle, which is called The Medium is the Massage, which came out in 1967. The book was produced, and this is an important word, produced by Jerome Agel, designed by Quentin Fiore, and went on to become a kind of mainstream cult success, selling reputedly something like 1 million copies. And Jerome Agel, I mean, I won't go into too much detail here, but who's a very, very interesting character, especially if you're thinking about audiences, for example, or access. He was inspired by George Martin. George Martin was the producer for the Beatles. And Jerome Agel believed that the Beatles wouldn't have been the Beatles without George Martin, without George Martin's kind of inventiveness, his creativity, his flair, his technical aptitude. And so Jerome Agel decided that he wanted to become what he called it was a book producer. So, we're familiar with music producers, but he wanted to become a book producer. And he wanted to do this for the most significant contemporary thinkers of the time, but particularly figures who were well known within, let's say, academia, or within more specialized area of activity. And he wanted to bring these thinkers into what you could call the mainstream. And so the first character that he worked with was Marshall McLuhan. Now, he had this was an advert that came out in a book magazine a year before The Medium is the Massage came out. And I love this sentence, a book that will show what's happening when what's happening is happening. It's very 60s, but it predicts the present. I've been obsessed with this phrase ever since I read it. It predicts the present, So initially you think, oh, well, that doesn't make any sense. Huh? We usually talk about predicting the future. But already by the mid-60s, And actually, J.G. Ballard talks about this in an interview in 1967, which you'll find in that book. The present had already been speeding up faster and faster. Technology had begun to play an instrumental role, and things were moving in a way at a pace that the present was no longer something stable. It was something unstable. And as such, you couldn't make assumptions about knowing what the present was. And indeed, what you needed to do was almost apply the tools of predicting the future to the present. Okay, so you know, and this is something that Marshall McLuhan had a real gift for. So the other thing that Jerome Agel decided as a kind of criteria for this new book was he wanted to take Marshall McLuhan's ideas, which up to that point had been written down in a number of books, such as the Gutenberg Galaxy, the Mechanical Bride, and then in 1964, a book called Understanding Media. Understanding Media, which came out in 1964. And but these were books, again, as I said, that spoke to academic audiences. And Agel believed that these ideas were too important to stay in the academy. They needed to come out, they needed to break out of the academy and break into the real world, you could call it. He decided he wanted to take Marshall McLuhan's ideas and make them, translate them in such a way that they would be accessible to a 10-year-old. And again, I love this. It's such a wonderful kind of ambition to have, no? To take a very difficult thinker or a philosopher and say, well, actually, I'm going to, in a way, remix this, and you know, a young child will be able to somehow access it. And then Quentin Fiore, who's the graphic designer for the book, he decided that he wanted to create what he called a dialogue between the computer and the book. Now, this is in 1967, right? It's extraordinarily prescient. Huh? I mean, a computer at that point were these hulking, huge machines that took up entire floors of buildings. Huh? You know, if you look at the computing that was used to help Apollo land on the moon, which famously, you know, has less computing power than most calculators, but spatially it would take up almost like a building. You know, for Fiore to say, you know, I want to create a dialogue between the computer and the book is like such an amazing, I think, a very evocative and powerful, again, ambition. So, fast forwarding now to 2015, Douglas Kupler and Hans-Ulrich Obrist, myself and the graphic designer Wayne Daly produced this. Alan mentioned it already. It's called The Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present. So this is our attempt to update The Medium is the Massage to the 21st century. Why? Because Marshall McLuhan actually died in 1980. So he never got to see the kind of permanently connected digital, technologically immersive world that, you know, we now call our present moment. So for the Age of Earthquakes, we invited 35 different artists to provide imagery for the book. And we assembled a black and white paperback, which has been wired for eyes and fingers that are accustomed to swiping or scrolling. And you could think of it like a paperback book that swallowed the internet from the first half of the 2010s. We were very happy that this was published by Penguin Books, and Penguin published the Marshall McLuhan actually in the UK in 1967. And so there was a very nice sense of a historical continuity. We picked exactly the same dimensions of the original book, a similar kind of paper. And again, this black and white aesthetic that linked it back to this kind of 60s style. Here are a few pages from how the Age of Earthquakes begins. Have you maybe noticed that our lives are no longer feeling like stories? Our lives are becoming a lineup of tasks. Our sense of time is beginning to shrink. So what is the extreme present? It's this, firstly, of course, it's the subtitle to the book, but more specifically, it's the realization that the causes of the modern condition are not going away. The forces driving the current world will only accelerate. Okay, and maybe a simple way to explain this using a new word. So in the book, we invented 28 new words, neologisms, and one of them was called proceleration. And proceleration, we say, is the acceleration of acceleration. So again, earlier I was talking about changing. We talk about acceleration. Some of you may have heard of the philosophical theoretical movement, accelerationism, for example. But acceleration, if you accelerate acceleration, then it accelerates instead of linearly, it accelerates parabolically or exponentially. And one of the things I've been thinking about, and I'm sure maybe all of you have experienced in some way or the other, is that the pandemic has been procelerating the future into the present, right? So things that were probably inevitable in the future horizon. We think about, Ala and I were just talking about travel, for example, or international travel. Now, the kind of sense of traveling with impunity, without care about, the kind of ecological impact. We lived through a number of decades of that. And now, if you remember 16, 17 months ago, that extraordinary moment where all the planes in the world were just grounded on the runways, on the airports. And, you would go to the airline tracker, these kind of amazing websites, and then you would see, instead, normally you see the planes moving around the planet, but they were just grounded in various airports. And, that is a kind of image from the future that came into the present. And so if we think about work, if we think about our interrelationships socially, all of these things have undergone quite profound changes over the last 20 months. And many of these are changes that will probably have happened, but they would have taken 20 or 30 years otherwise, perhaps, to unfold. So anyway, the sum of these sensations is something that I call change vertigo. And change vertigo is that unsettling sense of disorientation, where the future arrives at a faster pace than our psychological, emotional, and political capabilities can cope with, right? So, any of you who suffer from traditional vertigo will know that sensation when you get up beyond a certain height and you look down, and somehow, your body responds quite violently. There's a sense of panic. There's a sense in which you somehow can't process all the information of the predicament that you're in. And I think this is what we've been also undergoing now, but in relation to change, because so much change, because change keeps changing. Now, if we fast forward a year to 2016, what we learned then was that the 21st century's most valuable resource is you, with all your online behaviors, your enriched data sets, and millions of meta data points. Is data the new oil? Maybe, maybe not. It's one of the things that has been thrown out a lot over the last 6 years roughly. The 20th century was dictated by fossil capitalism, oil, gas, coal. All these things were fracked from the ground, from the sea. Now we've entered a new era. Some call it surveillance capitalism, data capitalism, computational capitalism. I prefer to call it emotional capitalism, because today's most valuable resources are your feelings and how those feelings are extracted, harvested, analyzed, commoditized, and then weaponized in many different ways that shape reality like never before. So all of this is a backdrop to our new book, which Ala also mentioned in the introduction, which just came out in the summer, called The Extreme Self. On the back, it says, if you're wondering why the inside of your head feels so strange these days, this book has the answers. It's a new kind of graphic novel about how and if and how individuality is morphing into something else. So the term that we, if we had the extreme present with the first book, with this book, the new term is the extreme self. The images inside this time are portraits and self-portraits sourced from 70 different contributors. But this time there are also designers like Craig Green and musicians like Amnesia Scanner, Fatima Al-Qadiri, and technologists as well. And they're from all over the world, from different generations. So it's also kind of, you could say, a contemporary exhibition of portraiture in this book. And that's because the face, our faces are, in a way, the basic unit of value and measure and exchange in this kind of new type of capitalism. So this is how the new book starts. The 20th century was about what belongs to who. The 21st century is about who belongs to what. So there's an important reversal there. For thousands of years, Earth's resources have been extracted by bodies, most of whom were not free. But now it's our bodies and ourselves being extracted. And mostly we offer it up for free. By merely existing, you're leaving a huge data smudge in the world, but it's not in the physical world, it's up in the cloud forever. On the right, a selective list of the different kinds of data trails, information trails that we leave every second of every day, if you're online, of course. I looked up recently, actually, I wanted to know, how many people are said to be online today. And the estimate is already 4.5 billion people, right? So if you think there's 7.8 billion people on the planet, minus how many, are under, I don't know, 8 years old, 10 years old, considered children or considered over 80 or 90. That's an incredible number, huh? I mean, I think we're almost getting to something like 80–90% of the kind of the size of the population that, you know, from an age demographic could be online, are online, right? So, and it's also interesting seeing who is more online, and it surprised me. I don't know if it surprised you, but you know, you'd assume, oh yes, it's the affluent countries in the West. It's actually not. It's like the Philippines, it's Indonesia, it's Nigeria. And you know, once you start looking at these metrics, actually, it makes you start thinking about the world, I think, in a different way. So the cloud is the new infinity. The cloud is the new infinity. And feelings now legitimize lies. So what does this mean for the concept of individuality? You know, and of course, the whole notion of individuality is extremely contested, complicated, deeply historical term. And there are countless traditions that either affirm the fact that the individual exists, and others that would say it doesn't exist at all. You know, so if you look at something like Buddhism or Shintoism, these are like almost like anti-individualistic ideologies. But certainly, you know, I think from what we might consider to be the birth of modernism and the birth of modern capitalism, certainly, the notion of the individual has been something that's been extremely important and extremely instrumentalized. So a question that we start early on in the book with is, do you still feel like an individual? Do you still feel like an individual? 20 years ago, this question would have made no sense. Now everybody knows what it means. We all know that we're changing inside our heads quickly, too quickly. Up until recently, people were simply people. Now we're turning into something else. We all feel it. We all know it. It's all happening faster than we thought. What if we need a new word to describe this thing that individuality is morphing into? You're now becoming your extreme self, and it's happening to you as you read these words. So the extreme self here is you could say it's almost a kind of placeholder term to occupy this speculative space that is conjured by the question, well, what if we're turning into something else? Okay, but what is that something else? And that's really what the book is about. I'm certainly not going to go through the entire book. I just wanted to pick out certain moments that I thought could be interesting for you in relation to your broader theme. There's a chapter, there are 13 chapters in the book, and it moves from the psychological, the emotional, to the social, all the way to, you could say, something like the eternal. But chapter 6 is called The New Crowd. And one of the questions that we ask here is, who matters more, the individual or the crowd? And you know, we started out thinking about, of course, digital crowds versus, you know, traditional physical crowds. But then over the course of the pandemic, I think the relationship between the individual and the crowd has also been, in a way, reformatted. And so, you know, this whole question of, you know, what constitutes a crowd? I mean, Singapore famously, pre-COVID, just always has had this definition that any group of people, more than two in public space, without prior permission from the authorities, is considered a crowd. And I find it so fascinating that at the beginning of the pandemic, Germany suddenly defined a crowd as more than two people meeting outside, you know. And so we've gone through this like convulsions, these like metricizing of what, you know, when does an individual become a group? When does a group become a crowd? You know, and of course the kind of the graphical metricizing of space, the 1 meter, 2 meter distance, 1.5, this kind of thing. So so I think the whole I think there's a new kind of anxiety to the crowd that some people, I think, will continue to feel for a long time. You know, and you know, the roots of this again go back to something like the birth of the industrial modern city. And if you read something like Baudelaire, you know, the crowd is one of these figures that is born out of the modern city, and from the crowd you get something like anonymity. So this great story called The Man in the Crowd, which is about how, you know, an individual can find anonymity in the mass of the crowd in a modern city. And so you know, these things that we've been thinking about over the last few years in terms of privacy, anonymity, you know, these are not new. I mean, these are concerns that have been going for a long time. It's just that they were traditionally on the street and now they're on the screen. And so, yes, and then we're also been, you know, what we're also doing constantly is figuring out where we exist as a kind of moving target in relation to a constantly shifting, you know, territory of politics, of course, political affiliations. And again, this is where language is very important, because for so long we've somehow, I think, been trapped in maybe, I think, an outdated schema such as the left and the right. You know, we've begun to see, you know, much more complex notions of political possibilities, horseshoe theories, Mobius strips. You know, this is a famous kind of politigram that became popular, certainly in the kind of alt-right parts of the internet from 2015 onwards. But, you know, the identification of me, you, us, them, again, nothing new, absolutely, you know, it's there as long as we've been alive, but you know, how these things being instrumentalized and also kind of weaponized. So then, as Ala mentioned, this, the book actually comes out, you know, a few years after an exhibition. And so what we did, and here I'm mentioning this because those of you who, from more from a kind of practice perspective, perhaps, or, you know, in terms of the relationship between, you know, if there are kind of different things that you do, if you curate, if you write, if you make films or whatever. But, you know, I think as a process, what was interesting about this project was that we started with an invitation by the director at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto, who read the first book, loved it. She said to me she could imagine walking inside that book, and said, you know, wouldn't it be interesting to make that book into an exhibition? And I said, well, the way that Hans-Ulrich Obrist describes The Age of Earthquake is a portable exhibition. It's an exhibition in a book. And but instead of revisiting the old book, we decided to take the invitation as a catalyst for to start the new book. And this was in early 2017. So we had you know, the various events of 2016. In my case, as a British citizen, the kind of horror of the Brexit referendum, and then, you know, of course the election of Donald Trump, and this like psychotic arrival of kind of blatant, not even crypto fascism. No, it was just like, okay, there's like a fascist, there's a fascist, TV superstar in the White House now. And so this became really the beginning. This is when we started the project. So I'm going to just walk you through very quickly through the exhibition at the Jameel Art Center, because what was interesting, as I say, the book hadn't come out yet. So we previewed half of the book in the exhibition, and also a number of works, which I'll show you very quickly. But, it started on the outside. We created this massive banner, which again sort of gave you a hint of what was going on inside this, and this politogram. I'll come back to this image of the emoji. You came in. This was the first room, and so the pages from the book had been blown up to quite sort of large poster size. They're printed on quite rigid, like a plastic board. And then we suspended them from the ceiling, chapter by chapter, with this like navigation system on the floor, just to give you an indication which way to proceed or how to move. But you could move by yourself. There were about a dozen works that were interspersed between the chapters. This is a work by Victoria Sin called Illocutory Utterances. And each of the works spoke to a different aspect or chapter of the book. But what was, I think, really important for the viewer was, of the visitor, was each of these works was a moment of escape from our narrative and our voice from the book, which can be, it's a strong voice. So instead it creates, I think, a multi-dimensional, multi-layered experience with what Hans Ulrich would call a polyphony of voices, many voices at the same time. So, in this film, Victoria Sin is uttering a monologue, and you are just focused on their mouth and this kind of droning music. This was commissioned by Satoshi Fujiwara, who's a Japanese photographer based in Berlin. It's called Crowd Landscape. It's a 22-meter long double-sided photographic banner print, which snakes around an 8-meter tall scaffolding tower in a courtyard in the building. It was very, very beautiful. On one side is a kind of hyper collage of very high resolution close-ups of old people's skin and their faces. And on the other side here on the right, you can see quite a menacing image of crowds taken at a May the 1st parade in Berlin a few years ago. And yes, and so this speaks again quite directly about the relationship between individuals and crowds. This is one of two beautiful works by Stephanie Sadeh, who's a Lebanese artist. It's called Digiprint. This was 4 meters high, about 2 meters wide. If you can't quite tell, I mean, it was a very interesting, people had very interesting encounters, because you look at it and you think this is a maybe an abstract painting from the 1950s or the 60s. But actually what happened was that Stephanie took her phone, her iPhone, to a photography studio in Beirut. She turned it off, put it on a table, and a photographer took a picture of the screen. So this is what our screens look like, right? This is I call it a forensic portrait, because this is a portrait of, you could see the fingerprints, but you could see grease, you could see dust, you could see hair, you could see the last swipes or the last apps that she used. And so, if we think about portraiture, then we are constantly making and erasing ourselves on these things like 1 million times a day, right? And And I think this speaks to maybe even a bigger idea, which is that it's seductive to think that our digital existence is somehow immaterial. It's quite the opposite. You know, the internet is extremely physical. It's actually extremely like 19th century. I mean, up till recently, I mean, many of the internet cables that are at the bottom of the ocean, you know, they're slowly being updated, but initially they were, you know, the very old copper telephone lines, you know, that have been there for decades, maybe even longer. So, you know, and then you think about server farms. So the digital is extremely physical. And I think what's beautiful about Stephanie's work here is that it's a reminder of that, right? That actually we shouldn't believe the rhetoric that suggests that somehow the virtual is immaterial. It's actually very material. So just a few other images. You know, this, we opened in January, and it was the first big exhibition opening since the pandemic. It was surreal to have 400 people come in time slots with our masks, of course. So there was, you know, the people had very strong reactions and responses to it because, again, in a way, it is a narration of what's happening to you right now. And that's one of the things that, you know, I'm interested in. And this is another commission by an artist called Yuri Patterson. And Yuri became very interested in the idea that the use of emojis is also being tracked, right? And so one of the ways in which marketing companies, for example, take almost like a temperature of how we're feeling is by tracking which emojis are being used the most, you know. And so so what Yuri did here, which was really amazing, was he took the 5 major eye emojis from the different platforms, and then he put it into a simple, it's called an array algorithm, or an array, sorry, the array function in Photoshop. But what Photoshop does is use quite a simple algorithm to create a non-repetitive pattern. So this is a non-repetitive, algorithmically generated pattern made out of eye emojis, and he scaled them so that the eyes are one to like as close as possible to our actual our eye size, right? So it creates an interesting kind of force field. We even put it in the elevator here at the Jameel Art Center, which Ala knows very well. And there's a mirror. So actually where you're looking from, there's a mirror. So it created also this like quite a kind of psychedelic space with these eyes. But this somehow set up our, you know, with Wayne, our designer, throughout this whole project, we've become very interested in emojis as a kind of, as a contemporary language to express emotions. And so we also made it we got to make some, you know, fun merch. So we have this webcam cover. I've got one where my camera is now. So you slide it across. And, you know, I thought about, I don't know if you've seen the film called Citizen 4 about Edward Snowden from 2013, but it starts with Snowden in a hotel room in Hong Kong. And, you know, Laura Poitras is there, and Trevor Paglin's actually doing the cinematography. And then Snowden has to take a Skype call, and he has this blanket because he doesn't want to be located. So he sort of throws the blanket over the laptop and over his head. And it's this kind of ritual that he which I thought was very funny. So I sort of thought about that with this webcam cover, and you know, one day I hope to get one to Snowdon. But we've also been making our own emojis, because in a way, one of the theses that we have is that we're now feeling emotions that are complex, not simple. So, you know, in the space of even 1 minute, I mean, Ala started here asking me, how are you? I have to say, I find it the hardest question to answer now. Like, I literally don't have an answer, because I could start the answer one way, but then 20 seconds in, I'll feel something different. And then another 20 seconds, I feel, you know, different again. And, you know, this is part of this kind of algorithmically driven, like emotional profiling that we have. Huh? So what we did here was we took this existing emoji of the exploding head, and then decided we wanted to somehow create an emoji that tried to convey this like sense of hybrid anxiety that we feel now. So here on the right is our new kind of emoji. We even managed to make this enamel pin out of it, which is really beautiful. And then in the exhibition, in the last room, we printed it out 4 meters high. And it, you know, this is this amazing gallery at the Jameel Art Center that's 10 meters high. And so, you know, you turned the corner, you entered the room, and you had this like huge emoji staring at you. And of course, it's another face, so it's another portrait. And then for the book, Wayne came up with this idea again of emotions that are nestled within other emotions. So you may know the traditional, you call it a Russian doll, or the matryoshka. Huh? It's a sort of where you get the figure in another figure, in another figure, in another figure, in another figure, and it keeps going. It's also a geological model. If you cut through the earth, you see that the earth is actually organized like this. And so Wayne, you know, he came up with this, and I just thought, oh, it's so fantastic, huh? This idea of one emotion inside another emotion inside another emotion. And so that, you know, became this new matryoshka emoji, which is what you see on the book. But what's lovely about it is it wraps around the spine and the back, so you don't see the full thing. You have to sort of twist the book around. And then just bringing you to the end of the exhibition. Here on the right, you have the whole emoji, which is 4 meters high, turned, you know, 90 degrees perpendicular, and so it becomes this portal. And of course, you know, a portal that can mean many different things to, I think, every different visitor who came. You know, is a portal to the past, is a portal to the future, etc., etc. So the last thing I want to talk about or introduce to you is from a recent essay that I've written called The Great Reversal. So Marshall McLuhan famously wrote that all technologies are extensions of our physical and nervous systems. It's been said that everything that we make, our tools, our media, emanates from our bodies and our minds. We are cause, technologies are effect. Somewhere in the past decade, when it comes to our devices, such relations have drastically and dramatically reversed. We are now, in some profound way, an extension of the phone. We are its prosthesis. The phone is cause, and we are the effect. This is a new power relationship. Let's call it the Great Reversal. History is littered with these switches, moments when the magnetic poles of meaning reverse. Now, the effects of the Great Reversal are so seismic that we've barely begun to apprehend them. I don't know if any of you remember something called Second Life. It was a 3D virtual world released in 2003. Its name implied that the world around us is first life and that the one inside your screen is second. But what has happened, and certainly again, this has been accelerated, procelerated by the pandemic, is the inversion of that, okay? Second life is now first life. So recent, very, very recent proof of this, of course, is Facebook rebranding itself as Meta. And Zuckerberg saying that Facebook will now be a metaverse company, whatever that means. Huh? But it has had an extremely profound impact over the last few weeks even, and arguably very, very soon. We've seen Microsoft Teams here already announced that Teams will be kind of will become a metaverse, where you'll be able to exist in a kind of virtual space with avatars. And Nike started hiring, advertised for new jobs for virtual material designers, which, you know, again, sounds so science fiction. But these are, you know, setting up a whole department there. And, you know, any of those who follow crypto will see that, you know, this has become the latest narrative to really pump in crypto land. You know, so that the projects that have been doing the best over the last month, month and a half, are anything to do with the metaverse, so particularly Axie Infinity or Decentraland, and the Sandbox now. And so, you know, what's going on is there are kind of new wars of generations taking place, even though no one really knows what a generation is anymore. But I think there is a war of generations. And in a way, you know, we've had Web 1.0, Web 2.0, in this lovely meme, which I like very much. You know, Web 2.0 is the boomer web. And so, you know, these like mega corporate, hegemonic structures of the internet, which go against the founding principles of the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee back in 1989, you know, because actually the internet is now really completely consolidated into just a handful of all-powerful companies and entities. And so we're seeing, you know, the promise of Web 3.0 as being a kind of attack on that, and the possibility of a, you know, decentralized web, etc. What here is called crypto-futurism. And you know, we've even had recently McDonald's launching burgers as NFTs. They've launched the McRib as an NFT. And now they're not doing this, I think, because they believe necessarily in this new paradigm, or they understand it, but they just don't want to be left behind, right? So, and I think none of this really would have happened at the speed at which it happened had we not all become captive to this space over the last 20 months. So again, the second life has become first life. And that means that, of course, you know, capitalism, you know, is going to do its best to exploit and inhabit this condition. So the last thing I want to say is that the feed, the feed that you swipe, that you scroll, with all its commentary and meta commentary, is a space with a very real emotional and economic consequence. The feed, of course, already is a metaverse, where the extreme self inhabits the extreme present, knowing and unknowing itself at the speed of the scroll. The end. Okay. Thank you very much. Hope that wasn't too long.
No, it was amazing. Thank you very, very much. really appreciate this presentation, eye opener on so many levels. It was amazing, and I love the show. I mean, I love the book because I've seen it, but also like to see how you also adapt it into a show, and also these emojis and all these words. So what were the other words? You said you invented 3 words. One was proceleration, and what were the other 2 words?
Yeah, well, no, in the first book, there are 28 new words.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
28, yeah. And so, for example, you have denarration.
Mm-hmm.
So denarration is when your life stops feeling like a story.
Mm. Nice.
Yeah, and then in the new book, there is one of the new words is autophobia, which is the fear of feeling like an individual. Another one is, well, actually, it's less of a neologism, but more a reminder that if you look at the etymology of consent, which, you know, has become such an important word, I think, over the last 4 years in particular. You know, consent comes from co to be, I mean, with sentiere, which means to feel. So it actually means to feel together. To feel together, you know. So it's interesting also to, I think, to look at words that are very familiar, but to look at how, you know, where they originally came from, you know. And then maybe there's one that I've been using, which is PTSD, but it's present traumatic stress disorder. So again, that speaks to this idea of, you know, trying to predict the present, because it keeps shocking you somehow. So you know, I woke up yesterday. Yeah, you know, I do crypto stuff, and I was following them, and there was a big dip in the market yesterday, and of course that's because the new variant, you know, the new variant Omicron, it's ridiculous, the name, was discovered. You know, the variants discovered that then tanks the stock markets and the dollar index, which then has a knock-on effect, of course, on crypto, right? So, and all of that happening the day after Thanksgiving in America, you know, like it's like, what? Like it's so perfect. It seems so perfectly scripted that, you know, and that's why I think also it almost feels more rational to be a conspiracy theorist today than not, because all these things just seem to happen so like too perfectly. No, it's like that. What? So,
like you can't imagine that they happen on their own. It's basically
exactly.
Amazing. I see that maybe Abdulrahman has a question.
Yeah. First of all, many thanks. That was really beautiful and scary. With your last slide, like the end, like immediately I imagine all the movies, you know, when there's someone running, the end is near, the end is near. It was exactly like that. The thing is, like, you took, like, I have like too many questions, like, but like I will try like to talk about like one of them. Okay. You talked about this thing about the generational difference, and now we don't have that. Maybe we can trace it like to the people born after the 90s, maybe until the 90s, like everyone who was born before that, he lived like the 2 words. He was not hooked to the internet, and he was hooked, so he noticed the difference. But the thing is, I always think about it in a way that also you talked about it. It's like about mastering the tool of the internet. Like we are like in this, we are like shifting from 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 like I don't know, to the future very fast. I don't know. And the thing is, we are all scared because we can't predict the future the way we did, and that's actually happened. If we look historically to it, that actually happens every once in a while. Like something happens. Like I think I read that when we invented fire, like something happened in the same way. The thing is, I was watching this documentary a while ago about like what makes human beings different from other animals is that we take everything to the extreme. And when I like read the title of your book, like extreme self, it's like, isn't that going to extreme like being human? As it brought me this question, like, is there something about like there is this, like we are this. We are not like going somewhere new, or like we are not destroying ourselves. Like that's us. Like the extreme self is like the human in its purest nature, which is scary, which is like frightening. I don't know. I just wanted to ask you about like that. Do you see that as like we can't inescapable? We can't like go away from that. Is it scary for you, or it's just like a scary phase, not like there is no coming back from it?
Yeah, I mean, just the first thing about generations, because it's something I've thought about a lot, and actually we've written quite a bit about this year, because Douglas Coupland became very famous in 1991 for writing a book called Generation X. And, you know, this was a novel, but quite an experimental novel that came out. And, you know, at the time of grunge and Nirvana and all of these things, and again, became again, incredibly powerful, neologism, actually. I mean, prior to that, you had this notion of the baby boomers, right? So, you know, the baby boomers are the generation who were born during the war or just after the war, for example. And Douglas wrote this book because he's born in 1961, and he said that you know, he didn't really identify with the boomers who were, you know, older than him, and so you know, he wrote this book, and then, you know, this somehow started this, in a way, it's a kind of industry of generation naming. Okay, so we've had Generation X, then of course we had Generation Y, and Generation Y are the millennials, right? Yeah. And you know, then there's another phrase that came out this year, which is really interesting, because millennials are said to have been born initially somewhere between 81 and 82. But if you say 81, then the very first millennials are turning 40 this year, right? So so you had this phrase, geriatric millennial. It's just so cruel. But yeah, you know, millennials, and they're not young anymore, huh? Like millennials are becoming kind of like slowly middle-aged. And then of course you have the Generation Z, right? So, and I mean, technically, I mean, Z is meant to start around 1996. I prefer to say like 2000. I somehow find that more useful, but and so, you know, when you look at X, Y, and Z, it's what you just described, because, you know, we talk about the pre-internet brain. So, you know, my generation, Ala and I think are the same age. You know, we have pre-internet brains, right? Our youth and even our early adulthood was formed before the internet really took kind of control. And then we've had to kind of adapt to it in our adulthood. Millennials are the in-between generation. Again, it depends where you are. But, you know, for many of them, they would have had their first experiences, maybe as young children. And so the internet arrives as an earlier level than for me and Ala. Then, you know, for Generation Z and beyond, it's just there. Right? Like the way in which I was born into a world with television. Like you know, there wasn't like, I didn't experience the arrival of television. Television was just there, no? So, so for Generation Z, they have not had to live in a time without the internet, right? Or without the digital. And so, this is a very classical way of defining generations, and one of the things that, something that came out this last year was the idea that maybe babies that were born, now during the pandemic are Generation C, Generation COVID or Generation Corona, right? And I mean, we just mentioned this Omicron thing. I mean, the naming of abstract sociological phenomena is a very interesting thing. No? So, and because Douglas started with X, it meant we got to the end of the alphabet very quickly, right? So we got X, Y, Z, then what do you do, Like, so there's a big debate, like what comes next? And interestingly, one theory that had been put forward a few years ago, which now can't work, was, we should restart with the Greek alphabet. But now the Greek alphabet's been used for the COVID variant, so it's getting very confusing. So, but no, so and I now have a different way of defining a generation, which is an individual's relationship to technology, right? Yeah. So, you can, so my dad is 84. And, he was too old to, like, he just never used the computer. We couldn't even get him to use a mobile phone. Like, there was something in his brain, it just wouldn't happen. My mum is 16 years younger. She's like sending me TikToks every 5 minutes. She's crazy. But my dad was technologically an outsider. A few years ago, we got them both an iPad. And I remember sitting down with my dad, who was probably about 78 or at this point or something. And, I spent an afternoon teaching him how to use the iPad. And ever since then, he's been addicted to this thing. And I feel like from that moment on, he finally entered into the 21st century in a way. And I think and I was there a few weeks ago, and they're talking to me about like crypto and Bitcoin. And they're like, yeah, the price of Bitcoin's gone down today. Well, and that's because, he entered a technological portal. And by doing so, I think he redefined his where he belongs on the generational timeline. So for me now, I think there's one way of defining a generation, which is purely to do with where, on a you could say like a materialist timeline, where you were born, etc. But I think maybe the more meaningful one is what relationship you have to technology. And I'm sure you all know, you can see, and that even gets more granular, because then it's down to like, which platforms do people use? So, a lot of, Gen X had tended to be the Facebook generation, Gen Y tend to be the Instagram generation, and then Gen Z would be TikTok or, the Chinese equivalent or the Indian equivalent. And, and I have, most of my friends are, they're like, I can't do TikTok, right? Like, and I realized by doing that, they also they show a certain age, or a certain generational age. And so I think, the whole question of what a generation today is a really interesting one, right? And I think it's one that we have to keep redefining. So, and then your second point, what I would say is that's why you have to read Marshall McLuhan, because what was wonderful about him was that, his entire study, his corpus is really looking at the history of systems of articulation and communication from like cave paintings to the television and radio, right? And so the birth of the pictogram, of the alphabet, the movement from the oral to the written, right? And then he did his PhD on somebody called Thomas Nash, who was it's called a pamphleteer. You know, pamphlets were like early versions of books, no? And they were only possible after the printing press that Gutenberg invented in the 15th century. And so McLuhan is this, what he does, which is so important, and I agree with you completely, and it's something that we have to do, is we have to zoom out and look at the longer time scale, right? Because these moments of revolutions, you could say, or earthquakes, are cyclical. They happen usually every few hundred years. Now, because everything gets faster and faster, they're happening, you know, you could say every year, maybe they're happening every month, every minute, right? Like, I mean, that's how it feels like to me. But it's true, you know, and that's why I think, you know, if you go back and you look at the literature of how societies reacted when the radio arrived, right? It's fascinating. It's really eye-opening, because, you know, for many religious people, this was like haram or something. Like, it was like, are these the voices of the dead? You know, is this a kind of necromancy? And you see it again with the arrival of television, right? And there's a sense of it being a corrupting force, et cetera, right? So it's, what I always say is that if you want to get some sense of perspective from our current moment, you have to zoom out and look at these deep historical cycles, you know, and it's, I agree, it's really important to put it into context. To be honest, it's the only thing that helps me get out of the sense of despair or panic. Because you realize that every time these things arrive, you see that the people who are affected most violently are the generation who were alive before the invention of that technology comes, right? Mm-hmm. So those of us who have to adapt tend to be the ones who are affected the most negatively, right? So, you know, the people who dealt with the first television culture versus people who, I mean, who gets worried about television today? You know, like, does anybody, oh God, television, it's the end of society. It's just like, no. And so I think we're still in a very early part of the timeline of, you know, of basically a digital hegemony, right? And so I agree that, you know, I think as new generations arrive and simply grow up within this environment, I think they're born with a different kind of coping mechanism and a different kind of defense mechanism as well, and also a different kind of intelligence. I think this is why older people are stupid, and I mean that in the most scientific way.
I totally agree with you on that.
Well, you know, one of the dangers is always trying to compare the present to the past. You know, oh, things were done like this and now they're like that, and why can't they be like that, etc. You know, so, and I think there's some. McLuhan always said, you know, one of the things he said was that one of the ways we misunderstand every new technology is by judging it through the prism of the previous technology, right? And in a way that it closes some of your sight if you do that, you know. It's important to know what happened before, but it's also important to look at what's happening now with a certain amount of, I think, objectivity, no? And not, let's say not just objectivity, but anti-nostalgia. You know, I think
readability, to be ready.
Yeah, exactly. Ability to adapt, ultimately, you know, this famous phrase, adapt or or perish or something like that. So yeah.
Very nice. Do you have a follow-up question, Abdurrahman?
Oh, we could talk for hours, I think.
Maybe somebody else. If anybody else has a question.
Yeah, if someone else, like, it's really great.
Sarah?
Hi, and thank you so much for this inspiring conversation. I was just wondering then, why do we think the medium is the message? I mean, if we do look at it from a bigger perspective and looking at the history of it, then yes, maybe when the radio came out, it was a message on its own, and the TV and the internet and so on. But at the moment, not so much really. And they do shape us as much as we shape them, media and technology. And we do say, like, if we take a look at, for example, the TikTok generation at the moment, where they keep saying, I'm acting like the main character in my own story. And they take it into their lives, so they kind of become the extension of the app itself, or the technology itself. But then we're co-constructed in a way. So where is the message and where is the medium?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's why we are at, I mean, that's what I was trying to get at with this, in this new piece called The Great Reversal. This notion of what's called pole reversal. So, like, there's a very interesting thing geologically, I don't know, millions of years time, the North Pole and the South Pole will switch polarity, right? So the North is positive, the South is negative, they will switch. I think, history, or human cultural history, is also made of these pole switching. The one I think about a lot is also in the 15th century. It's Copernicus, and it's there's the moment where Copernicus discovers and then explains how the Earth isn't at the center of the universe anymore, right? With literally just one planet in a solar system, in a multitude of other solar systems and galaxies, right? This like, and again, I think it's so hard for us to appreciate just how violently distressing this discovery was, no? Because what it did was it displaced us from the center of reality, ultimately, no? And so I think history is ultimately a kind of history of displacement, no? It's displacing one paradigm with another constantly. So that's important to understand the morphology of history, but also it's important to not be trapped by it. And so I do think, yeah, we are going through, I mean, I had this, actually, this whole notion of, that, so McLuhan would say, this is an extension of this, right? So that is still an anthropocentric model that says, that the human comes first, and then everything comes, as an extension of us, right? The wheel, the screen, the book, the car, etc., is an extension. But it was when I was standing in front of actually the first digiprint by Stephanie Sade that I showed you. And the first one was much smaller, actually. It was in a gallery here called Grey Noise Gallery. And she explained what she did. And I just, like, something happened in my brain, like weird fireworks. And I thought about this, this thing that McLuhan said, actually, and Deleuze and Guattari talk about it as well, like in Mille Plateaux, it's basically this notion that, you know, man creates tools, right? And then we create tools in order to reshape our environment, and then that environment then changes us, right? So it's a feedback loop. But this notion of the tool as an extension, like if you think about farming, you know, what farming could be possible without the invention of specific tools. Huh? But I was standing in front of Stephanie's this digiprint, and I just thought, oh my God, what if it is the other way around? No? What if this comes first, and actually I am an extension of it, right? And I think we're in a similar role reversal now in terms of medium and message, no? But it's extremely complicated, because I would argue it's constantly reversing, you know. And the minute you think you've understood the power relationship, because that's what it is, huh? It's a power relationship. It's actually become something else. And so the main character syndrome that you talk about is really interesting. You know, if you think about, as say in the first book, we're talking about denarration, right? So that your life doesn't feel like a story anymore. Well, how do you deal with that? You know, if you feel like your life doesn't feel like a story, and by that we mean at a more macro level, no? You know, that you're born, that you'll have a certain kind of childhood, that you'll have a certain kind of education, hopefully you'll have, and then you'll get some sort of professional training. You'll do that for a certain number of decades in your life. You'll meet a partner, hopefully, and maybe you'll have a family, and then, you know, and at some point you retire, and, you know, I don't know, you go golfing, or you go on a golf cruise, on a cruise or whatever. And, you know, the truth is, that kind of narrative, even for much of the middle class, is no longer a certainty anymore, right? So that's a macro story that I think doesn't really exist. I mean, the notion of a job for life, I think, is also something that's going to be historical, generally speaking. I'm not including artists or writers here, you know, but generally, you know, you were trained to be an engineer, and then you'd be an engineer your whole life, whatever, right? Like, but again, if things keep changing, there's a possibility that your job, or what you were trained to do, becomes redundant 10 years after you trained yourself, no? So this is what I mean by when your life doesn't feel like a story. I think, you know, something like main character syndrome is almost an attempt to, you know, to fight against that, and say, well, actually, I'm going to make my life a story by becoming the main character, no? And maybe I can't control these macro forces of history or economy or politics, but, you know, I can certainly control how I am perceived. I can control the narrative that people look at me through, no? And
the problem is the main character is hugely mediated in that sense, and then there's kind of no agency in who you are anymore.
Oh, completely. But it's a kind of, you know, remember the film The Truman Show? Yeah. I mean, I think about that a lot, of course. So this idea that you're starring. I mean, in his case, he didn't realize he was starring in a kind of fictional production. But, you know, I think, again, it's like people are now in their own versions of the Truman Show, but they know they're in the Truman Show. You know? So there's this way in which, and Baudrillard would have written, you know, has written a lot about this kind of thing. If you like, his book on seduction is really helpful on this, you know. So there's a sense in which, you know, you can be seduced by the lie that you can perform as a truth, right? So, I mean, that's the interesting thing about online personalities. Like, we all know that these are constructions, but even though we know, we engage with them as though they were not constructions, no? And so we're constantly, it's this sense of being, and this is why seduction, I think, is really important, because there's some, it's more pleasurable. It's like, it's more pleasurable to believe the lie and enjoy the lie than be the righteous person that says, I know that it's false, right? So, and of course, this is what, you know, reality TV has certainly accustomed us to, I think, now for a number of decades. And it is not, you know, therefore not a surprise that Donald Trump was a reality TV star, no? And ultimately he turned the White House into a kind of television set, no? And the interesting thing there was that, you know, half of the world, or certainly half of America, was horrified, but the other half was like, yes, you know, this is great. Like, this is so good. Like, what is he, you know, literally, what has he done today? You know, like that sense of waking up every morning, like the way you would turn on a new episode of the Kardashians or God knows what, you know, and like what's happening in this episode. And so this sense of, you know, and I think that's why, yeah, I agree. I think that's why these binary terms that we've had for so long, you know, real and unreal, fiction and fact, and you know, they're almost useless now, right? Because we're clearly not in these binaries anymore. Like we're in some swirling swamp of the unreal, no? And but just last thing I would say, it's interesting that there is this, I think, because the tools seem to empower you to present yourself as though you are in control of a story. You know, that's just a very seductive thing for a lot of people, it seems to me.
There's
go ahead.
One thing that you are talking about. I think, like, what makes us think that at any point in history that we had agency? Like throughout all history, we never had agency for anything. I mean, for men and women, like no one had, like small group of people, like in certain positions, they had something, maybe. For example, like you mentioned it, like 2 minutes ago, like about marriage, about love, like it's like quite recent, like notion that you get married because you love someone. So the idea that like the lie that maybe was like exaggerated in the 60s, 70s, that we owned our like life, I don't know, maybe that's the thing, that we still like waking up from that dream that for a moment there is someone who had like an agency, a dream for the life. I used to be like actually scared from the future, but like no, not like in the last couple of months, because the way I see it, like it's becoming more true. Like it's everything is deconstructed. As you said, there is no normal job. I said, like universities, school system, there is nothing normal. They will never be the same. So as I see it, as much as it's scary, I see it as much as it may be like the potential there, like to create something, or like to, as also you said it, like how someone may weaponize that the tools that we have now in the same hand, with the same actually technology, we can make I don't know, like a different or like unlimited alternatives for that.
No, I agree. I mean, this is why Outlook is such a critical tool of navigation, no?
Yeah.
Because but again, that's why I think understanding history is deeply important, but it's also important to have some sense of freedom from the predestination that, you know, history would tell you that things have always been a certain way, no? And it's just, again, it's never been the case, no? I mean, just as an aside, you know, getting into like all this crypto stuff has made me, like, I basically researched money for the first time. And I'm now like so horrified that I think, you know, we're unless you study economics or finance at university or something, we are not taught the history of money. And when you taught the history of money, you realize, well, actually, I mean, money ultimately is a fiction like anything else. It's basically a consensus protocol system, right? Like many, many other things, but arguably the most powerful one. But that systems of money are, you know, are brief, and they're constantly being replaced by something else, right? And so those are, we've only ever known a world in which the dollar has been the reserve currency. But it literally just goes back to basically 1971, no? And then before that, it's Bretton Woods in 1945. You have the gold standard, right? And it's like the timescales are incredibly short. But when you're inside it, I mean, that's why the Truman Show, I think, is such a useful analogy. When you're inside the narrative, it's as though the narrative has been there forever. But actually, when you study it, it's only been there for decades. And, you know, I mean, it's said that actually every monetary system has a lifespan of about 90 years, and we're actually coming towards the end, arguably now, of that lifespan of the dollar. So, you know, it's I think this is why, yeah, knowing what's come before is so important. Not in the sense of knowing the details, rather understanding the cycles, right? Like understanding, and it's ultimately the story of empires as well, right? I mean, it's the cycles of how power works ultimately, no? And so, you know, power comes, it ascends, it establishes itself. But the interesting thing about power is the minute it establishes itself is usually also the beginning of its decline, right? And so, you know, and by definition, and I think we see this with America now, and for me, that's one of the things that's been so palpable over the pandemic is like, do you need more evidence about the end of the American empire than how they have dealt with all of this? No, I mean, it's just like, wow. And I think everybody else outside of America is just like, okay, yeah, like, all right. And then of course, but obviously from within, you know, we're still number one, we're still that. And I think everyone else that has any clue, you know, just knows that, well, actually it's over there. You know, the future's that way. And so yeah, you know, I do recommend, I mean, if you've not read McLuhan, do pick it up. Look at his book, The Gutenberg Galaxy. And just this whole notion that this is it. Every time, I mean, his whole thing is that, yeah, every time there's a new paradigm of, let's say, media or communication, it has this seismic effect throughout, you know, global society, but also our internal landscapes, right? So, and yeah, that I find that extremely helpful, because ultimately, you know, what we're going through now, I mean, I always say that it's giving ourselves too much importance if we say that what we're going through now has never happened before, right? Like
that's one of like my last question, I swear. Like when you like you talked about like the circles of life, that if we like took a step back and like look to the history, we can see it. We can see the traces of this cycle. But like one of things that like one of the interviews that you sent like to prepare for this radio interview, you talked about I don't know if it was you or like one of your colleagues, about the singularity of the future, that we are already living the singularity of we are living that. Is that concept is okay? I agree that we will always go to the singularity, but we will never reach it. That's I agree with that. But the thing is we are like going with these cycles of power, going to a singularity, a great singularity, or we are like now accelerating towards somewhere. I don't know. I would love like to hear more about it from you.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who don't know this term, the singularity, it's a phrase championed by somebody called Ray Kurzweil, who's a very interesting, curious character that makes more sense in like a science fiction framework. But he's postulated that if you extrapolate the advances in computing power and the progress made specifically in, let's say, artificial intelligence, that at some point the machines will reach a kind of mythical and also almost like an exponential moment where they will reach something like consciousness or something, and therefore be capable of maybe free will, agency, and ultimately disobedience, right? And he's even given a date to this. I think it's like 2030 or something like that. And it's an idea that has had a huge purchase, of course, in Silicon Valley, to the extent where Ray Kurzweil has been, he's been almost like researcher in residence at Google for a number of years. And, he's a figure that people like Larry, Sergey Brin and Larry Page from Google, really value him. He's part of the Singularity University and all of this stuff. But for me, this is also very, it's a convenient narrative. It makes for great science fiction films. It's ultimately what, if we think about AI, it's usually big through the precedents in film and cinema and television. And it's usually the same narrative, if you think, it's this notion, of the machine will reach a moment of emancipated sovereignty, and it will ultimately turn on us, and they will go from being the slave to the master, yada yada yada, And I'm much more on the side of like Donna Haraway, who already said in 1985, famously, of course, in a Cyborg Manifesto, that we're already cyborgs. And I mean, I think it's a misnomer to only think of technology as a drone or as a VR headset. I think the minute we made the first lens, we kind of became cyborgs. No, like this is a technology that enhances my physical capabilities, and kind of gives me a superpower. No, I mean, I literally can't see without this. Suddenly I can see. Like my usefulness in human society means one thing when I have this on, and when I don't. No, so I think we've been cyborgs for a very long time. I mean, Hito Steyl, I think, has this great thing, which is, we shouldn't be talking about artificial intelligence, we should talk about artificial stupidity. And that actually, we should be more concerned with our own stupidity than we should about how intelligent machines are, really. And ultimately, the intelligence of machines are directly related by the limits of our own intelligence, but also the limits, frankly, of our stupidity. So, you know, I think that, I mean, we have a slightly ironic take in the first book about the singularity. A film that I like actually here is Spike Jonze's Her, if you've ever seen this film.
Yeah.
You know, which is about the lead character who falls in love ultimately with an kind of operating system that, you know, is plugged into his ear. And what's beautiful about that is that, you know, it's just a voice. It's Scarlett Johansson's voice, and she doesn't have a body, right? She's not some super voluptuous vixen type thing. Again, that most of, I mean, Ex Machina, I think, is an interesting film, but it's a little bit in that, like, it's very like male gaze, you know, sex bot kind of thing, right? And I think what's interesting about Her is that he ultimately falls in love with a kind of, you know, I mean that, and I mean, I don't want to give the ending away. If you haven't watched it, I do recommend it. But for me, the ending of that film is actually one of the most intelligent notions of the singularity. Like it turns the whole narrative of master and slave inside out and speculates something much more, I mean, much more enjoyable, but also I think much more likely as well, you know. So I recommend that, you know. Anyone else? I don't want to go on too long. Ala, let us know when we run out of time, please.
I'm glad we circled here, actually, because that takes me to my second question around the Turing test, and why you mentioned that empathy would be our next Turing test, especially that AI science has not really developed much. The only difference we have is that we have access to much bigger processing power and much bigger data sets. So in that sense, why do we need a new and updated Turing test towards empathy rather than actual intelligence?
Well, because I think that, honestly, I think intelligence is a really useless metric. Like, what the hell does it mean? You know, like, what does it mean? You know, we know that you know, Big Blue beat Kasparov back in '96. AlphaGo beat the world's best Go player a few years ago, back in 2015, roughly. You know, we know that it's so clear that these like computation, you know, that machines are so much better than we are computationally, right? Like anything to do with, it's a no-brainer. Now, I mean, my calculator is faster than me at simple mathematics. Why should, I mean, chess, yes, it's a game of strategy, but it's also a game of probabilities, no? So anything that works on like schematic probabilities, you know, but is that how we've defined intelligence, you know, human intelligence? No, right? Like, so that's why, again, many of you will know this, you have, most of what we have in AI is basically called narrow intelligence. It's called, the singularity would be something, it would have to come out of artificial general intelligence. So narrow AI is basically algorithmic, right? Like you train an algorithm to do one task and do it really, really well, and it learns through doing it, and it gets better and better. But it's like you can't go to the famous IBM Big Blue that beat Kasparov and ask it for an omelet recipe. It wouldn't know where to start, right? Like, because it's only been trained to play chess, right? So artificial general intelligence would be finally something that would break out of the narrow, you know, and so I think that, yeah, I personally think intelligence is a really misleading metric, you know. And I suppose we play with the idea of empathy because, I mean, to go back to what Ahmed was saying, you know, what are the things that I don't know, we think makes humans human, although it's not exclusive to humans, but arguably, you know, where does social care come from, right? Where does social responsibility come from? Where does community building come from? Where does the notion of the reallocation of capital come from? Arguably, empathy is an important element of that, no? And one of the phrases I really like is somebody described the early novels as a form. They described novels as empathy machines. So what the novel allows us to do that was really quite groundbreaking was you're able to enter into somebody else's consciousness that isn't yours, right? So and so you're able to, you know, you're reading the story from the first point perspective of somebody, of a murderer, no, or somebody, or a mother who's lost a child, or a judge who has to judge a terrible case or something like this. And you know, one of the and the interesting thing, I mean, I talk about this elsewhere, that I think where I think virtual reality, that for me, the promise of virtual reality hasn't come true yet, because I think virtual reality ultimately should be an empathy machine, right? Like, I think at its best, we should be able to put something on and enter into somebody else's consciousness, you know, that isn't ours, and then see the world from their perspective. But you know, what would it mean for what would it mean for a machine to have empathy? Like, we don't even know where empathy comes from, even in our own brains, you know. So like, how do you start to engineer it? You know, so I would rather use that to measure the singularity, you know, other than, I don't know, like maybe you heard of something came out last year, was a thing called GPT-3 through Google. And GPT-3 is so there's GPT-1, there's GPT-2, and now there's GPT-3. GPT-3 uses a data set of about 170 billion data points. And the result is, what GPT-3 can do now is you can start a sentence and GPT-3 can finish the sentence for you. And the more that you write, the more that the GPT-3 learns your style of writing, right? And so it almost becomes a co-author. And it keeps learning better and better. And it is incredibly good now. And you compare it to what GPT-2 was, which is about 3-4 years old now. And you're beginning to see like this, like singular, in a way it's beginning to, it's one of the things actually I've seen that comes closest to this like singularity thing. Because, you know, most computer writing in the past, I think, we've been able to tell, no? Like you can tell spam emails, you can tell the kind of weird computer language. With GPT-3, to go back to the Turing test, actually it kind of passes the Turing test. And there's a book, there's somebody called Kay Allodal McDowell, who is head of Google Arts. And he's written a book with GPT-3 as a co-author. He did it because he had early access to the technology. And it's super interesting. Like, you know, he has a conversation with it. And there are moments where it points to a different kind of intelligence. It's super interesting. So we're getting, we're already in many ways at the singularity, I think. But this whole notion that one day we're going to wake up and a human-looking robot is going to turn around and say, "I'm now the president of the world, and you know, you're all my slaves." No, I'm not so sure. But yeah, I think I think, and this is why this great reversal for me is really important, because, you know, what does it mean for us to be an extension of GPT-3, for example, right? And one of the commercial ways in which GPT-3 is now being used is, for example, you know, you have all these like websites which need tons of copy to be written in them, you know, especially commercial ones. I don't know if you think about Wish or, you know, all these like Amazon type vendor sites, right? Like literally millions of items have to have text written about them. So now these things can be automated, you know, like humans don't have to write these texts anymore. Like, wow.
Which means a lot of people are going to go out of jobs again.
Yeah.
Wow, this is all really like amazing, beautiful, scary, as Abdurrahman has said. Wow, thank you so much, for this very generous conversation and presentation, and also for this intriguing discussion. I learned so much today. Thank you so much. I'm sure some of the participants have also picked up some intriguing ideas and thoughts. And
it's been great. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And yeah, I hope we have more of these conversations in the near future. It's very refreshing and very empowering, I must say.
Thank you. And thanks for your amazing questions. They were
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. So
I hope to meet you at some point in the future. That'd be really lovely.
Yes, I hope so too, for everyone. It'll be great.
Okay, everyone.
Shukran.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.